Alright y'all, so today in this video I want to do a very quick review of a direct-to-video Marvel animated film that I'm sure a lot of kids growing up in the early 2000s got the chance to see. And in a lot of ways for some kids, this was probably their first version of the Avengers ever brought to the screen, so to speak. Before the MCU was a thing, before the MCU 2012 Avengers film, this film came out in 2006. In this video, I'm going to be reviewing Ultimate Avengers, a direct-to-video animated film that came out, part of a series of Marvel animated films that came out shortly after this one, but this one specifically came out in 2006. It's a very loose adaptation of the Ultimates, which was at the time the Ultimate Marvel comic universe, a reboot of the typical Marvel universe. And in their continuity, the Avengers are called the Ultimates, and there was a whole comic series, and I did a couple reviews of that. And to kind of get into a little bit of background for this video, this movie is really nostalgic for me. I grew up with this movie quite a bit alongside its sequel, which I will eventually talk about. And this was kind of like my first version of the Avengers. You know, obviously I grew up in the MCU as well, but this was technically my first version of these characters I ever saw as a really young kid. You know, the version of the Hulk here, version of Captain America, the general lineup of the team. That's why when I eventually saw the MCU Avengers movie as a kid, I was kind of perplexed, like, why isn't Giant Man here? Or why is Hawkman here? And even though at the time I didn't quite understand the logistics of it all, it was just, like I said, this movie left a lot of impact, and I'm sure it left a lot of impact for a lot of other people. And I just kind of, recently just rewatched it. At the time I'm making this video, it is free on YouTube, so shout out to the people who uploaded this. Weirdly, it's not on Disney Plus. I really don't know why, since it's a pretty great Marvel animated film, at least really solid. So now, of course, we're going to get into my opinions on this thing. I'm going to give you my pros, my cons, and my overall initial opinions and overall thoughts. So to kind of start out, I probably already spoiled my opinion on this, but I think overall, after rewatching this is a really solid animated film. I think it's pretty good. It's not great. There are some problems. There are some hiccups here and there. And it's really funny comparing this to the comic that it's based on, Ultimates, which I wouldn't really call this a direct one-to-one adaptation. It combines elements from different, issues in that series, hugely waters down and sanitizes a lot of stuff. I mean, if you've read the Ultimates comic, you know what I'm talking about. And like I said, they probably had to, because I think many people kind of assume the Ultimates was like a crazy comic and the Avengers and stuff, and it was more PG, but it's kind of one of those things, like, you assume on the surface, but you've actually read the comic. Yeah, Mark Millar writes it, and, there's a lot of Mark Miller-isms here that he throws in that I think could have never made it to an adaptation. And I think, honestly, this version of the movie, the more watered-down version, I think was all the better without him. So to kind of get into my pros, and to kind of also get into my cons, starting out with my pros, I think, for the first and foremost, the animation's pretty solid. The animation, I think, still, for the most part, holds up. It's kind of got this realistic kind of animated style. I mean, it obviously looks like a lot of the animated films that we see in those early 2000s from Marvel, and a lot of Lionsgate Marvel films and such. But I think some of those have dated a bit more compared to this one, because I think the reason why is the use of CGI and digital and more computer-generated stuff is less present here. Everything is pretty much 2D animated, with probably enhanced with some Photoshop or enhanced with some digital coloring and shadowing, because everything kind of has this glossy, shadowy look to it. I think it works for the most part. The art style works for the most part. It goes for a different, more simplistic style, while the comic book, The Ultimates, went for a straightforward, very much, of that time, action movie approach. And part of me thinks I wish they would have leaned more heavy into the art style of the comic here, just because I think the comic genuinely looks great, and some of Brian Hitch's artwork looks fantastic. And I kind of, like I said before, it would have been a bit difficult to replicate that, but, there's really cool stuff here. I also, too, really like how this movie incorporates elements in the future Ultimates comics. And in general, I think the plot is decently well structured. You get a sense of each of the heroes and how they're introduced into the story. This team that they're basically pulling together called the Avengers, which is it's not called the Ultimates here. It's called the Avengers. Really interesting side note. And there's like a lot of really interesting quirks about it. For example, Nick Fury doesn't really unite the Avengers in this. That's one of my little cons. Like, I feel like there's like if you compare it to the movie that we did get in 2012, there's little quirks here and there. I think the movie did better, but there's also some quirks I think this movie also does really good. For example, I really like the fact how the movie opens similar to the comic, and how the aliens are pretty much introduced right away. And they're also more open about being aliens. They show their Jatari form. I really like that little difference. It's pretty cool. I like their artistic design, how they look. It's much more better than the comic. Because the comic, they're basically scrolls. But it's mentioned that they eat their victims to become that person's body, right? To replicate them. Thank God that wasn't put into this movie. They're just aliens and they want to conquer everything. And I think in general, the motivations for certain characters here is a lot better. For example, in the comic, the Jahari are doing this whole undercover decades operation, and basically out of nowhere, some other aliens talk to them and say, "Oh yeah, we need to blow up this star system. We're leaving." It's so random and so confused, and it just doesn't make any sense. In the movie, while it's not explicitly stated, it makes more sense with the aliens and the Jatari and their motivations here. They just want to destroy S.H.I.E.L.D., wipe out any opposition to their potential rule. Very simple, very clean, nothing weird like the comic was. I also think the fact they introduced Kleiser, which he's a character that would get introduced, I believe, in Volume 2. I don't think he was introduced in Ultimates Volume 1, but he's kind of brought on here, and you can tell they're putting the seeds for a bigger antagonist for the second movie. I like that here. They show, like I said, they're kind of placing seeds for what they're going to do in the next movie. That's pretty cool stuff. That wasn't in the comic. I also like all the Captain America development stuff. That was really well done in the comic as well. But one additional note is that the character that was Cap's girlfriend, I'm really forgetting her name at the time I'm making this video, but she actually talks to Cap. She gets the courage, and at the end of the movie, she talks to him while he's injured on the hospital bed. That was a really sweet scene. I like how that was kind of resolved. In the Ultimates comics, it doesn't happen, and we don't really get a scene like that. Well, we do get a scene like that in the MCU, but one of my criticisms of that movie, which I haven't seen, frankly, in years, is that they didn't really do enough of the Captain America development stuff. This movie really does, and it's really well done. I like the whole storyline revolving him. He's kind of the main character of the movie, so it's really cool stuff. I like how Iron Man's done here. There's this whole thing of Iron Man is not Tony Stark. People don't know who he is, and then they eventually find out. Obviously, I prefer the MCU version, but it's pretty well done here, and it's pretty, like I said, it contrasts, heavily from the comic, but it's pretty well done. Also, designs. I want to also kind of make a really quick note on the designs. They change up some of the art style here. Cap's suit looks pretty similar to the Ultimates. Hulk looks pretty similar. He looks slightly more green, but that's fine. Thor looks the same. Black Widow looks the same. Actually prefer Black Widow here a little bit more than I do the comic for sure. Wasp, Giant Man. Iron Man is the only one that looks drastically different, and that's just because in the Ultimates, it looked more bulky, and there was way less red and yellow. But I do like both designs equally well, but I don't mind the limitations the liberties they took at redesigning him. He looks fine. He looks cool. And I do like how the team kind of comes together, how initially they really screw up and they fail their first mission, and then they eventually, Cap kind of unites them all, and an alien invasion happens, and they sort of just pull themselves together to stop the invasion. It's pretty cool stuff. Very similar to the 2012 movie, and I guess in a lot of ways, the Ultimates comics as well. Now, the sequence of events and how things happen are combined here. For example, in the Ultimates Volume 1, the big conflict is that the Ultimates have nothing to do. They're just kind of sitting around, twiddling their thumbs, And Bruce Banner basically becomes the Hulk to give them something to do and fight. While here, it's the kind of, Banner here turns into the Hulk at the very end because it's a plot line that's been set up. He's been studying the super soldier serum, thinking he can control the Hulk as Banner, which obviously fails, and then Hulk becomes a raging monster at the end that they all have to defeat. So, kind of similar to the comic, but Banner here, I guess, is doing it for a much less, I guess, selfish reason. In the comic, like, Banner is clearly in the wrong. He's messed up for what he's doing. I mean, there's logic to what he's doing, but messed up. Here, he's more, like I said, he's a bit more sympathetic. He's trying to crack and do a super soldier serum kind of thing, and, it's an interesting deviation from the comic. I would say that my opinions are kind of the same on both matters, but, overall, pretty positive thing. But yeah, I like that aspect of it. I liked how the aliens are kind of invading. They have much more of a presence here. And it's pretty cool stuff. The animation's pretty cool. They mention how they have like vibranium ships and stuff and vibranium armor, which I'm not exactly sure if it's mentioned in the comic, but it's pretty cool stuff. So, yeah. But yeah, the animation's really good. The voice acting's fantastic as well. I think the voice acting's really good. Obviously, it's kind of hard to not picture anyone else as Chris Evans as Captain America, especially since after he became so popular in the MCU, every version after has been kind of influenced by him. But I think it's pretty cool to see a version that wasn't influenced by the MCU. I think all these guys that are the voice cast, so to speak, is really good, and I think they all do fantastic jobs. The guy that got the voice Tony Stark is great, and the guy that got the voice Captain America does a great job as well. I think another huge standout is the guy that got the voice Bruce Banner and Hank Pym Giant Man, which they all do a really great job, and in particular to the ones I just mentioned, they're really a big standout in the cast. Like, they're really good. They really do a good job at voicing their characters. In terms of other positives, I can say the action's pretty good. I think the story and structure is pretty solid. And, reading the comic, there's just so many awkward and Mark Millerism moments in that comic. I'm just glad they didn't put them in this movie. Like, for example, the whole thing with Giant Man. That was pretty great. I'm glad that we didn't get a really awful scene where Hank Pym verbally and physically abuses his wife, Janet, with a very creepy scene where he's controlling ants to torture her, and then he has to leave, and then Captain America kicks his butt, and he's like a giant, naked, giant man. Glad that wasn't in this movie. Really great stuff. And I can kind of go on and on. Like, the villains are more approachable here. Iron Man is more approachable here. Though I will say I do miss the aspect the really great scene where Iron Man talks to the Ultimates about his motivations and stuff and why he became Iron Man. Not really in this. You don't really get a sense of his character as much, which sucks because it's a great scene in the comic. But overall, pretty solid animated film. Now I'm going to get into some of my cons and kind of elaborate on some of the ones I already mentioned. So I already mentioned the fact that certain moments from the comic that are really good aren't here. Like, for example, I wish we really got the scene with Tony Stark talking to the Ultimates about his motivations to become Iron Man. That's not really here. And there's certain aspects and characterizations of people that are kind of missing here. That, like, there's a really great scene where Bruce Banner's talking to Nick Fury. Like, it's like the first opening shot of the comic when you get past the Captain America stuff. Kind of wish that was there. I also kind of wish there was more characterization for Thor, Iron Man, Giant Man. I think the problem is that the movie is squeezed down into an hour runtime, and I wish that they had more time to play with their characters and explore more motivations, especially with the aliens, which I think they do a better job when they get to the second movie. But I wish we would have known a little bit more about their motivations beyond the superficial, I'm just going to attack the Triskelion and S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters because we're bad aliens, right? I wish there was more motivation to them. In general, just beefing up all the characters and stuff. Add more character depth, character motivations, add that really good scene where basically the team unites, so to speak, which I don't think was really quite here. But, regardless, I don't have too many other cons about this. The voice acting solid. A lot of the moments in this that were really awkward and Mark Millerism moments are omitted here. I'm really glad. I can go on forever. I'm glad we didn't get a scene where Hulk had his rampage and then Betty talks to Bruce about it. Like, Betty's relationship with Bruce in this movie makes sense, right? She's like, realizes Hulk is not a good thing. He's a danger to society and should be treated as such. And, the whole flimsy of, oh, is Banner going to turn into him and Banner doing this and that. And Banner's relationship to Betty makes a lot more sense. In the comic, she's like a bitch. Like she's a horrible person. And she gets, like I said before, one of those Mark Millerism moments. She gets turned on by the fact that Hulk eats people and destroys property. It's just one of those things, man. I have no words for it. It is one of the worst parts in a Marvel comic I've ever read. I don't want to turn this video into a huge comparison video, but it's hard not to when you've read the comic and you've watched this version, The Ultimate Avengers. So I think that, but yeah, like I said, I think that in terms of other cons, despite the fact I think the plot is decent, it's structured, I think the events make sense, I just wish that certain elements from the comic and story development could have been put in here. I think that the comic had a really great scene that kind of explained what the Chitauri were. That wasn't really put in here, which was really a shame. I think that they could have really added that scene to the movie. I also think there could have been other scenes, other character development. I also think the pacing could have been a bit better just because the movie sometimes feels like it's rushing to a conclusion. And I think that the fact is, like, they only probably had an hour to do this, and I wish they had more time. Like, I wish they probably had, like, an hour and a half or something. Give it an extra 30 minutes, add some more character development, add some more structure and more information and depth to the plot, and this could have been a, like, 10 out of 10 animated film. And that's really my only huge cons with this movie. Some of the pacing, some of the weird story decisions, the lack of motivations and depth for certain things. But to kind of give you my really quick overall opinions, I still really enjoy Ultimate Avengers. It's a really solid movie. It's decent, has some great has some great voice acting, has some really good story elements here and there. And I think overall it's a decent introduction to the Avengers. I would arguably say still the 2012 movie did it better, but I think this is still a really solid movie. Despite some flaws with character development, depth, and certain things I felt like were left out from the comic, but also the really great thing that this movie watered down many of those awful moments from the Ultimates and made it for a much more suitable and viewable experience, which obviously is another huge pro this movie has to it. So overall, really solid movie, a great introduction to the Avengers. I'm sure many other 2000 kids got the chance to view, and I think for the most part this movie still is pretty solid and holds up. It's not great, still has its flaws. It's not like the top 10 Marvel project of all time, but overall Ultimate Avengers from 2006 is still a really good and solid Marvel animated film. Alright, y'all, hopefully you have a good day, and peace, y'all.